welcome everyone. I'm Professor Goodman. For those of us, if we haven't met yet, this is like our 5th or 6th week now, so I think all of us have met nearly. I'd like to welcome students, faculty, members of the greater community to this evening's event. In addition to the International Studies Public Forum, it's also brought to you by the Institute for International, Global, and Regional Studies, as well as the Center for Citizen Peacebuilding. Now, to introduce tonight's esteemed panel of speakers, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Paula Garb, who you might know, you may have taken a class in social sciences, anthropology, or from the Center for Citizen and Peacebuilding. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Garb, who will facilitate this evening's events.
Hi everybody, thank you and welcome for your participation. We look forward to hearing from our guests. I'm going to give a brief introduction of each of them, and then each will speak for no more than 10 minutes each to present sort of their main ideas, not sort of, but their main ideas, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. I want to first, though before that, let you know that the Center for Citizen Peacebuilding is an organization that's been at UCI since 1999. And we have some flyers up here, which you can find out more about it by taking the flyer at the end. But what we do is facilitate dialogue, do research on citizen peacebuilding, have educational programs on citizen peacebuilding. We are turning research into action for a safer world. We've got a new nonviolence program that we're rolling out and look forward to doing that with you. We have gang intervention training, which is now going to begin its 3rd time here at UCI. We're beginning to give trainings in nonviolence for students on campus, for people in the community, and we have various projects in various parts of the world studying citizen initiatives for peacebuilding, and we're looking forward to hosting one of many of our Nobel Peace Prize winners who have come to UCI, and in October we hope to bring to you a Peace Prize winner who, for her work in Liberia, organized women single-handedly, got the women of the Islamic and Christian communities to non-violently protest with what was a very violent civil war. And it's just a great example how, you know, the answer to the question, what can I do? She had an answer in her community. She got a Nobel Peace Prize for it, for stopping the violence and creating an environment where they've had at least 10 years now of peace and democracy. So we have many programs underway, and this is one of many, and we do hope that also we can create a safe space here for everybody to have a conversation about really a very important subject, and all of you are here for that. So let us proceed. We are first going to hear from our colleague from the Sabancı University. His name is Fikret Adanir, and he is from the Faculty of Arts and Science, is a professor emeritus, and has agreed to be part of this panel, and we look forward to hearing what his thoughts are. He's from Istanbul, and the university is in Istanbul. In fact, all of our guests are from Istanbul, except for the 2 who are local. Etienne Machoupyan, who is of Armenian descent. He is a well-known journalist and writer in Istanbul, in Turkey, and for 3 years, from 2007 to 2010, he was the editor-in-chief of IIGaRS, the Armenian Community's weekly newspaper, and he also contributes to the Turkish national dailies Taraf and Zaman. Next, we will be hearing from Levon Marashlian, who has taught here at UCI and who is a very active member of our faculty in many ways, and also teaches at Glendale College. He's a professor of history and political science, and at UCI, I believe he's been one of the 2 professors who's, or maybe the only one, who's taught on Armenian studies at UCI.
Yeah, there are more.
Okay. And we'll also be hearing from Edvin Manassian, who is a lawyer and who is an executive board member of the Armenian Bar Association. So all of them have perspectives to share on what we're doing, what are the prospects of having Armenia-Turkey dialogue, the different perspectives. So we shall begin. I would like to ask our guest to come forward, and the speaker will start out here, and then during the Q&A, our panelists will be there. So Fikret, would you like to speak from here?
So thank you very much for this greeting, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. So I am a historian, and what I'm going to tell you now, in a very brief fashion, has to do or said from the perspective of a historian. No need to repeat here that Turkish state has consistently refused to recognize the catastrophic events of 1915, which led to the extermination of Armenian communities in Asia Minor as genocide. So this is a topic that, well, I would say is going to come and discussed here also today. The political implications of this official position will be expounded by my colleagues who come from a social science background. From the standpoint of an historian, I must say that in the field of genocide studies, there is quite an important development since 1980s, actually, because genocide has become a legal as well as political concept, and rather controversial, and has focused on the genocidal intent. So, as if a scholar in the field is looking for a single document which will explain clearly this intent of destroying whole community. This made it easy for the Turkish state, I must say, to choose the same approach. So they have the state archives at their disposal, and they operate with them, and they can show you that there was not a single command, order, go and kill the Armenians. Historians, by their profession, are almost, I must say, liable to contextualize events. For example, they ask questions like, why 1915 and not 1912 or 1910? And who were the victims? Only Armenians? Whole Armenians? Were there regional differences? How about Syrian Christians? Perhaps was it the genocide of Christians by Muslims? So there are so many other questions. So this complexity, well, logically leads to a certain relativization of the issue of genocide. And that's why many people, especially diaspora organizations and their representatives, they of course are since decades fighting to get recognition of something that historically happened, and no doubt about it. That's why my position today is that we have to understand each other's intentions, each other's agendas. I personally use the term genocide in my teaching I have taught in Germany for a long period, about 30 or 40 years by now, and since 2007 I have been teaching in Istanbul. And in my class, as well as in my published work, yes, I use sometimes the term genocide. And I am not the only one. You know, Taner Akçam started in 1980s, but there are a new generation of Turkish scholars, younger people. They, today, on TV programs, in their articles published in journals, they use this term. But as I said, that would lead us into a, how shall I say, cul-de-sac, so to speak, because there is no need to try to persuade those who are already convinced. We have to, in Turkey I mean, we have to reach the majority of the populace. Turkish people have to learn that they have a collective moral responsibility for what has happened in the past, and this we can only try to show to them that being victims themselves of expulsion from the Caucasus, of the Balkans, is not in a way a blockage for them that they can at the same time be perpetrators. So, if you think genocide is committed or ordered from top down by a certain minister, a certain government official, that is rather the easy way to do it. We have to take into account that it is a very complex process, and that participants are many and quite high number of people involved in killings of Armenians and Syrian Christians, and these killings were not in the same manner in every region and not in every year. There are certain focal points in 1915 and 1916, and some regions Armenians survived in high numbers, in other areas not so, it was much more difficult for them. So historians have to try to explain these differences and try to create an understanding of the complexities. So this much I'm going to say at the moment, and hopefully then we'll have a fruitful discussion afterwards. Thank you for your attention.
So, I will start with the heading of this panel. It says Turkish-Armenian relations, and to use the word relations comes to me as an exaggeration, because we don't have a relation. In fact, we have a mutual paralysis when we look at the Turks and Armenians today, and not only today, but maybe for 90 years, starting with the 1920s, that is. And there is a basis for this mutual paralysis. There is a symmetrical understanding on both sides. There is the assumption that the other is homogeneous and not changing. So Armenians think that Turks are homogeneous and they are not changing, and Turks are thinking that, or have assumed that Armenians are homogeneous and they are not changing. So if you think that the other party is with such qualities, then you don't have to change yourself. And so this assumption turned out to be correct at the end, because when we assumed in Turkey, for example, that the Armenians were not changing and they were insisting on one rhetoric only, and there is no hope in hearing something else, then the Turks, in majority, thought that their own rhetoric, as a not changing rhetoric for 90 years, was a correct one. And this was the case for Armenians too. Armenians took the Turks as a homogeneous subject, and they assumed that they are categorically, historically fixed, frozen. So it was just logical for them to go on repeating their own rhetoric for 90 years. Now, if this is the case, then we confront with two actors doing just activism and not politics. And this is, again, the case today. Now, when you do politics, you try to change your attitudes, your strategies in order to influence and change the positioning of the other. But if you have no hope of changing the positioning of the other, if you think that that positioning is a fixed one, then you go to activism, which is insisting on your own attitudes and strategies, because you assume that you cannot really do anything to the other guy. So this was the case on both sides, and we have to see that the issue of genocide, it was a very convenient issue for both of them, for both positions. Because genocide, or history itself, when it is called a genocide, which it is, of course, gives you the chance to have a kind of an alibi for your ideology, which is fixed already in history. So you have one party who is calling 1915 a genocide, and you have another party which is saying that it is not a genocide. And as long as both are doing those activistic, activism, whatever, then no matter how many years will pass, centuries, this situation will not change. Because there is no persuasion, there is no really relation, there is no communication, and there is no effort to change the way of looking of the other. And this approach on both sides was very, very detrimental. Especially in the diaspora, in the Armenian diaspora, the genocide was taken as the core issue of the community life, and one of the results was that it blocked the free development of art and culture. And secondly, the past, the history, was a hostage, or became a hostage, in the hands of the power relation of today. When we come to the Turkish side, it was much more detrimental, I would say. There was a denial strategy from the state, and the state was such a state that gave the identity to the population. So the Turkish identity, in fact, was an identity, or we can say is an identity, created by the state and given to the society. So the state defined the citizen, and when it defined the citizen, it also defined how the citizen should understand history, how he should talk about history, how he should think about history. So it was a kind of a sickness, I would say, for 90 years, or maybe for 80 years, because it is changing today. But it had two results. One is alienation from your own history, from your own culture, because without the Armenians, there is no really Anatolian culture, or it is lacking a good part of it. And secondly, it served in enhancing and consolidating a very authoritarian republicanism in Turkey, and it ended up with too many coups d'etats and military tutelage and so on and so forth. So from this point, I want to come to two observations. One is that we have two problems. One is the problem of 1915 and genocide, that question. And we have another question, and that is what have we done in these 90 years? So, if there is a blockage today, it's not only because of 1915 and genocide issue, but it's because what we did in those 90 years, or we did not do in those 90 years. And as you may know, there was a message of condolences from the Prime Minister just 10 days ago, on the 23rd, 20 days ago. And that was addressing this second question. We mustn't mix that with the genocide issue, because what the government in Turkey had in mind was not addressing the genocide issue, whether it is a genocide or not, or whether there should be a compensation or not those things. They had in mind to change the attitudes of today, their own attitude and the attitude of the Armenians, or inviting the Armenians to change their own attitude. And the second point is that message of condolences, of course, it's addressing the Armenians, you know, it is talking to the Armenians, it is talking to the world, but much so, it is talking to the Turkish society. It was a message specifically for the Turkish society, and it was saying something very simple, but very dramatic. It was saying, we may have and we will have another history. And this is very, very revolutionary in a country like Turkey. Because history was developed by the state institutions, especially regarding issues like the Armenian issue and so on. So Turkey is on the verge of changing its own regime, and this message of condolences is serving in this dynamic of transformation of the regime. Now, a last note is maybe should be given as to how we have come to this point in Turkey. And very briefly, this can only be explained by the Muslim identity coming forth and being a global identity, becoming a much more important identity than the Turkish identity. And so the distance between the Turkish identity and the Muslim identity is getting larger and larger today. Now the Muslims, they don't deny the Turkish identity, they are not bothered with Turkish identity, but they need less the Turkish identity as they needed, 10 or 20 years back. So what is happening is that since the Turkish identity is very much connected with the state, the Muslims in Turkey have a distance now with the state as well. So that's how this government is taking steps in the Kurdish issue and in the Armenian issue. So when we look ahead, I think what lesson we can get from what we have gone through all these years, for 90 years, is that we have blocked ourselves in a point where everyone felt very comfortable. The Armenians felt very comfortable because they had the right, they were at the side of the justice. They were the victims and so on. And just by repeating those words, just by repeating this advocacy, they thought that they are doing the best for the Armenian cause, quote unquote, and they felt as Armenians. And on the other hand, Turks, being state-driven, they were repeating the words of the state, the rhetoric of the state, the ideology of the state, and thus they were becoming proper citizens of the Turkish Republic, which was a very authoritarian regime. So now it's time, I think, to go beyond that, to look at ourselves, to have some self-critique, and move from activism to real politics, which is touching the other, talking to the other, understanding the other, and influencing and trying to change the other. Thank you.
The Armenian Genocide has been fully documented, and there's no need to go over all that. Just to illustrate how well documented it is, let me read you something very short from Özgür Ünlü Husarcıklı. He is the director of the German Marshall Fund in Ankara. And in a recent long item, he has this small passage. He said that Turkey should acknowledge that throughout the world, it is now a generally accepted view that the Turks committed genocide against Armenians in 1915. And he's right. There's several other Turkish observers who have said that the battle over whether or not it was a genocide has been won. And there are many of the references like that. And one indication of that is that in 2005, the president of the Turkish Historical Society, Türk Tarih Kurumu, was debating a prominent Turkish journalist, not debating, he was a guest on his show, and he said that if we continue like this, the government policy of trying to deny this way, he said, we're going to lose this. Kayb ederiz, he said. This is the president of the Turkish Historical Society said this, I think it was 2005 or 2006. So years have passed since then. The next piece of evidence that this issue, in terms of genocide or not, is settled is the latest statement by the Turkish Prime Minister himself that we just referred to. And in that statement, just the fact that he offered condolences, keep in mind, the statement of the Turkish Prime Minister just recently was something new, it was new, but it was still an attempt to deny the genocide in a more gentle way, denial light. But when the head of the government uses the word condolence, offers a condolence, that's a major shift on the part of the government. And another part of his statement is that allowing open discussion of this. He said this, in Turkey, expressing different opinions and thoughts freely on the events of 1915 is a requirement of a pluralistic perspective as well as of a culture of democracy and modernity. Some may perceive this climate of freedom in Turkey as an opportunity to express accusatory, offensive, and even provocative assertions and allegations. Even so, if this will enable us to better understand the historical issues with their legal aspects, and to transform resentment to friendship again, it is natural to approach different discourses with empathy and tolerance, expect a similar attitude from all sides. Now this sort of indicates from the Prime Minister that he wants to allow open debate of this issue, fully open debate in Turkey. And he also referred to what happened to the Armenians in 1915 as inhumane consequences of relocation. And the Turkish Foreign Minister, Ahmet Davutoğlu, also used the word inhumane. Inhumane is a pretty strong word. It's not genocide, but inhumane is a strong word. So to develop a relationship between Armenians and the Turkish people, to eventually lead to some kind of reconciliation, I think what is needed is to focus on the consequences of what happened to the Armenians. Not that whether it was a genocide or not, of course it was genocide, but what are the consequences? And the consequences go beyond the killing of 1 to 1.5 million people. Because in the process of that genocide, a whole nation, the Armenian people, were destroyed also culturally. Not just the bodies were killed, but culturally. There were about 2,000 churches in the Ottoman Empire, in what is today Turkey. Almost all of them, except for a few, have been eliminated, destroyed, seized. That's a huge amount of cultural heritage. Manuscripts, other works of art, libraries, all these churches would contain all kinds of valuable items, art pieces, documents. All that was confiscated. The national property of the 2 million residents of the Ottoman Empire was confiscated. And the personal property of approximately 2 million people was confiscated. Huge amounts of money was confiscated. What this becomes is, it's not just a matter of killing people within a few years, but the elimination of a people from the soil that made them what they are. It's the soil, it's the land that makes Armenians what they are, or makes the Irish what they are, Ireland makes the Irish what they are, and so forth. By removing them, by disconnecting them from that soil, it subjects that nation to ultimate disappearance, ultimate extinction. So you might call it maybe ethnocide. The ethnic group is subject to destruction. I'm not speaking for the Armenian diaspora or anybody else, just for myself. But in my opinion, and many Armenians do share this, but I'm speaking for myself, that when we speak of dialogue or eventual reconciliation, I feel that both sides have to face this issue of the consequences and how to remedy those consequences. And to remedy those consequences, what is necessary is what is commonly called restorative justice. The dead cannot be brought back. But some form of justice, justice comes in many forms, but some form of justice is necessary to make some kind of amends to enable that nation that was subject to destruction, to enable that nation to continue with its culture, to continue to flourish. And when it comes to the issue of justice, restorative justice, it's often mentioned by Turks. Here is a mention from Faruk Loğlu, used to be an ambassador, and recently he said this: currently the Armenian issue is a political one for Armenians. However, if they are successful in getting the US Congress to make a decision in favor of their cause, they will take the political issue to a legal level, such as by demanding compensation, land and compensation. This is a former ambassador. So there are frequent references to the idea of some kind of compensation, some kind of justice. And it may sound crass when we're talking about genocide, where the main issue is the destruction of human beings. It may seem crass or insensitive to talk about the material aspect. But in all genocides, there is an economic component. There is a financial, economic interest that leads people to destroy a nation. Almost all genocides have that component. So that issue cannot be avoided. Again, the dead cannot be brought back, but through justice, the victims can be made partially whole. And I think an eventual settlement of this Armenian-Turkish dispute or conflict, whatever you want to call it, would be good for both sides, for Armenians and for Turks, because this issue is a burden in Turkey, and today's Turks who are personally innocent, obviously, nobody who was actually a killer in 1915 is alive today. They are personally innocent, but because of the untenable policy of the government, in Turkey today, millions of Turks are also victims. Armenians are victims of the denial, but today's Turks are also victims of the denial because their policy of their government subjects them to the accusation of genocide when they themselves were not responsible. So today's Turks have to carry on their shoulders an albatross. The albatross of being associated with this kind of crime, for which they are personally innocent. However, it it becomes important for today's Turks to, as much as possible, encourage their government to move toward a recognition and restorative justice so that they will be freed. Germany atoned, acknowledged the Holocaust, atoned, paid reparations, and today the German people do not have to constantly face demonstrations at the German embassy or consulate. It doesn't come up constantly because justice was rendered. And I feel that today in Turkey, more and more Turks are coming forth with the courage, the integrity, the honesty, and the bravery to speak openly about this. Things that are being done in Turkey today, being said in Turkey today would have been impossible to hear 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So let me finish just by saying again that eventually to move forward to a dialogue and to reconciliation, eventually some kind of restorative justice, a discussion of restorative justice has to be made to settle this issue, an American U.S. Army General James Harbord, who visited that region in 1919, he called this this most colossal crime of all the ages. Thank you for your attention.
I don't know what I can add to this, but I'll do my best. And before I start, I also want to say, I mean, I'm sure you've all heard in the news that there was a devastating tragedy in Turkey. In a mine, over 250 miners died, and my personal condolences to the people of Turkey and the families, of course. For the Armenians, again, I don't speak for anyone but myself, but since that's the way we frame today's discussion, the diaspora, we must understand, is a consequence of the genocide. I mean, diaspora would not exist but for the genocide. So we must therefore understand why 50 years, 100 years, and if it takes 150 years later, the diaspora will still be taking the position that it takes, that it is a genocide, it is not up for debate, discussion. And so if anyone wants to engage with the Armenians, we have to talk about how do we go forward. But the elements that make up the genocide, and what Professor Marashlian says, how we get to justice, which is ultimately what's going to solve, hopefully, this problem before us, has never been provided to the people of Turkey until, again, what we've heard all the references, until about 10 years ago when this government got into power. For the first 80 years of a republic that was based upon a total different mindset of erasing history. Of course, the Armenian Genocide being a major component, but also their own Ottoman history, Turkish history, and all of that. That was based upon a newly devised, designed, fictitious, facts. And as books were allowed to be written, and as the people got somewhat educated about what the consequences were of that change and what existed before, we have had, of course, the word genocide can be used more freely in Turkey. You can go into a bookstore and you see books that relate to the area. These are, for those who live there, monumental steps. But of course, looking from the diaspora perspective, it's incremental steps. And you must understand from the Armenian perspective, Armenians have many times been burned, and that's an understatement. Relying on a new government that was in opposition coming in, Armenians are made promises, and then that new government that was the prior opposition ends up being even worse than the government that it replaced. And that's what happened in 1908. So now, and they should be doing it more faster, of course. They should be learning that there were 2.3 million Armenians living in Anatolia, Western Armenia, as the Armenians know it, as their ancestral lands of thousands of years. That was never talked about. And that Armenians owned businesses, Armenians had prominent roles in the Ottoman history and government, architecture, and throughout what is today's Turkey and the rest of the empire. Armenians were, called like a religious minority, never recognized as a nation. And the numbers were questioned. Of course, that was contradicted by another denialist position, which is the Armenians were traitors and helping the enemy, and they were going to destroy. So, but they didn't even have their act straight, right? Did you have Armenians or did you not have Armenians? So that's changing, and that needs to be taught, learned, and we have no problem with that, because that is the basic elements. I mean, there was 2.3 million people, like the professor said, 2,000 churches, birth records, baptismal records, business records, and they existed. Next day and today, they're not there. Why aren't they there? Now, the letter, the condolence letter, those are great steps, right? And we just heard something very important for me over there is it's better than any previous government. It is an opening, and I believe that, it requires some sort of recognition. However, it does not even say that the tehcir, which is the relocation, was wrong. It says the consequences of the relocation were wrong. In other words, it could have been a decision maybe made rightly, but it didn't turn out okay. And if you contrast that with a statement made by the Prime Minister on the Kurdish question, I think a year and a half ago, if there were massacres in Dersim in the late 30s, where the government, killed a lot of Kurdish citizens. And the Prime Minister, a year and a half ago, did not express condolences, but he expressed an apology. And he said, I apologize not on, we didn't do it because it's our opposition party that did it. However, as the office holder, the current executive, chief executive, I apologize. So one would have expected, since Turkey must make strides towards this, that we could get closer to that apology, and I hope that it will come. But Armenians, don't forget, have this major trust issue. They have been burned many times. They are suspicious of any attempt, and that's why anybody who tries to build dialogue and bring people together needs to be careful. For what they have gone through, Armenians have major trust issues. They are always suspicious of manipulation. They're always suspicious of anything being putting makeup to impress the European Union or the United States or whatever. And how are we going to get over that? The trust building. So for that reason, Turkey must take additional steps. Turkey must start with the way it treats resident Armenians over there better. I mean, they cannot speak to this most of the time, but the Armenians here can speak to that. And then Turkey must treat Armenia better, given the history. And the third, justice. Whether they accept that it's a genocide or not, and something we will not debate. What happened is people were told, within a few hours or tomorrow, you got to leave your home. You can only take a bag with you. And these are undisputed facts. And people from not only the eastern regions of Turkey or southeastern, people except for those in Istanbul or in Izmir, or in their immediate environments, were told you are supposed to march. These were old people, young people, diabetic people, heart disease people, babies, and all of that. And they were told, oh, this is for security purposes, we're going to keep a record of your possessions, properties, etc. And then when the war is over, you'll be back. Of course, what really happened we know. Very few of them made it alive to the deserts of Syria. And relocation turned into exile or murder. And the entrustment, remember the properties that was to be held by the state until they come back, they got relabeled abandoned properties. So, exile, abandoned properties, instead of, something similar to the wrongful acts of the United States government during World War II, when the Japanese citizens were supposed to, be put in camps and come back. Wrong, legally wrong thing. But this was something 100 and maybe 1,000 times worse than that. So, if Armenians are expecting justice, it's not only recognition, and it's not only reconnection, it's not only reparations to our communal properties, which is the second thing, like the church has mentioned, but it has to be putting aside any and all technical arguments of time limits and this and that, and explain to the Turkish people, and this can be done individually through civil service, civic society, and at the governmental level, that justice demands that these people be, put right. And on top of it, the overall dispossession and uprooting of the Armenian nation from its homeland has to be in some way compensated for or rectified. And that's all I have now.
Let me ask this question.
Go ahead.
For the Turkish gentleman, at what age that you become familiar with Armenian genocide?
That's a good question.
So the question was, how old were you when you first learned about the Armenian genocide?
Well, if it is just an answer from my perspective, it would be probably not so satisfactory, but I will say that this is the position of many Turks or citizens of Turkey. You have to know that a very high percentage of people in Turkey are themselves not from Anatolia. So my grandmother came to Anatolia in 1924 and had never in her life met an Armenian or didn't know anything about Armenian genocide. Okay? So many people are that way. For these people today, they are discovering that Asia Minor had a plurality of ethnicities and cultures and religions, and that Turkey, today's Turkey, has to recognize these pluralities once again, and as we heard now, Edwin Minasyan mentioned it, that there has to be some kind of restitution, that is, some kind of peace has to come in. So for that reason, in my case, I, of course, was a believer of Turkish nationalism. I was an elementary school teacher in my youth, and I would have refused vehemently if anybody said that Turks committed the genocide. But mind you, my parents were not in Asia Minor, okay? But since I live in Germany, and I hold a German passport, I feel today responsible for the Holocaust. This is also something that you can explain morally, just like many Armenians, members of Armenian diaspora in the United States, I believe, feel also responsible to what happened in American history to the native populations or whatever. So this is the requirement of being a citizen. So we are trying today to instill in people in Turkey this feeling. For example, a Kurd colleague or friend can easily come up and say, we are the victims, why should we be responsible for what happened to the Armenians? But if they feel as citizens of Turkey, then they have to also accept that there is a collective moral responsibility. So this is our position today in Turkey, how we are trying to teach people or create an empathy for situation, for the problems. I hope this, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is a question for Professor Levon. I was surprised and intrigued by your mentioning of restorative justice. That's something that I personally study, and I'm not sure that everybody in the room knows what it is. So I was hoping that you could briefly clarify what it is and also elaborate more on how you feel that restorative justice is used on this international scale, because it is, in my understanding, that's used mostly on a community level for healing, and in this situation that we're talking about now, it's both political and social and cultural.
So the question is about restorative justice. Maybe not everybody in the room knows what that is. So his question to Levon Marshalian is how he's looking at it and thinking about it in this case.
Restorative justice, as I understand, is a legal term, right? So I'm not a lawyer, and luckily I have a lawyer next to me. I know that term from its common sense aspect. To restore someone as a victim, let's say somebody robs your house on a personal level, and the thief is caught, and not only should the thief go to jail, but if he has your property, your flat screen TV and your furniture and your jewelry in his house, part of the justice is he has to return that. It's not enough just to put him in jail, but he has to restore the property he has. That's my layman's understanding of restorative justice. Am I correct? I don't know.
May I add?
There are different kinds. As I said, there are different kinds of justice. Justice can come in many forms, and in the case of the Armenian issue, total restoration would be impossible. Total compensation, impossible. I can't define it, but I'm speaking in principle. As a principle, my feeling is that asking for some kind of justice is legitimate, but at the same time, I know how difficult it is, and some people say it's impossible. I'm speaking from the point of view of legitimacy. So the claim for justice is legitimate. How much that justice could be, how it could be implemented, that I don't know. That's a very difficult task.
So
you might know more about restorative
justice, I think the way James is using it is the parties themselves decide how to restore the relationship and what form justice will come in. So it's not necessarily about punishment, but definitely restoring the relationship in a way that suits the parties.
Yes, and my layman's understanding of it is consistent with that the two sides discuss and somehow restore, and as you're restoring the relationship, who is the one who should get something restored? It's the victim.
That's what the parties decide together.
Exactly. But in this case, in my humble opinion, in this case, documentation, historiography, over decades has established already who the victim is. Now it's a matter of the victim and the victimizer, or the descendants of the victimizers, because the victimizers are not here, but the descendants to sit down and come up with some kind of formula to get to that restorative justice.
Just brief, since I was referenced here. The word punishment, whether we want it or not, doesn't even belong, because the perpetrators are not alive. Okay? So genocide being a crime, we don't have a Milosevic to arrest and bring to The Hague. So the punishment part really is not a possibility. Financially, the entire loss of the Armenian nation to be compensated, also not a realistic possibility, right? So what we do have is, sitting together with people with good faith, not throwing red herrings like, whether it's a genocide or not, because whether it's a genocide or not, unlike what they say, doesn't determine the restorative justice issue. Okay? If it's a genocide, yes, there will be criminals and they could be arrested, like I said, but they're not alive anymore. It's an international crime of an individual crime, genocide. What happened is dispossession. And that, as you said, it has to be, but the first steps, in my opinion, personal opinion, must come from the side of the perpetrator, and they can make strides. It's like mountain climbing. You make those first few safe steps, and then the others can meet you halfway.
Sorry. I would like to add, as an historian, small information. You see, the people who had been deported were Ottoman subjects, citizens. And at the end of the war, which was in the Turkish case, which ended 1922, these people were still Ottoman subjects. And they came and they wanted at Lausanne to come back and to settle in their villages, and Turkish parliament discussed this issue, and it was decided in the negative. So actually this is a crucial issue of the whole genocide complex from the point of view of today. What can be done for reconciliation? And there, I think, in Turkey, people, general public as such, have to come to terms with this reality. Okay?
May I? I'm just sorry. And I totally agree that the public has to be educated. The public that I know of had no information, probably less than 0.5% of academics probably know all those details, and that's so important. But again, I'm not a historian, I'm a lawyer, but I have read the Lausanne Treaty, which was, and under the Lausanne Treaty, I read a clause that gave 2 years for anyone who had been an Ottoman citizen during the time period in question to come back and claim their property, and they were given 2 years. And what in reality happened is those few people who were not Armenians, imagine Lebanon and Syria was carved out, so you could have been a Lebanese citizen or a Syrian citizen, which Armenians found themselves to be de facto at the time, and come and claim if you owned property in what now became Turkey, before it was one country. While, for example, a Lebanese non-Armenian was allowed to come and get property, there was active resistance and prevention of all Armenians to come back and claim their property. And then the 2 year ran out. And that is why when I spoke, I said, if anybody's genuine and they're in good faith, you don't get into technicalities like statute of limitations or 2 years ran up. You go there, your formula is there. It's in that clause. And since this in American law, we have certain things called unclean hands. If you have unclean hands, you're a perpetrator, you've prevented something, you cannot claim, it's getting too technical and I'll end, you can't raise affirmative defenses like statute of limitations. In other words, you can't say time ran out when you are the one who prevented things happening during that time. You have unclean hands. So you're not allowed to. So if somebody's in good faith, we can start with the Lausanne Treaty and move on.
Any other questions? being sympathetic to the minorities in Turkey since the early 2000s. But he's allowed Kurdish to be taught at private schools and so forth. But one of you was speaking about that all perhaps being makeup. That's what I was reading into your comments. That's all being makeup or camouflage for his, maybe the AKP's party trying to get into the European Union. And I'm just wondering, given that for example, that the murderers of Hrant Dink, the prominent Armenian journalist and editor, have not really been brought to justice. Erdogan himself has not been trying to bring them to justice. What does that say about the AKP party and the Armenian issue?
He will do the makeup.
He'll do the last question. I'll do the first.
Well, you have to realize that we have a very, very complicated situation in Turkey, because judiciary is not an impartial judiciary, and you have to have judiciary on your side if you want to make the reforms, because otherwise there is a resistance from the bureaucracy, and resistance means maybe that the military tutelage can come back and so on and so forth. So what AK Party did, AK Party came into power. They didn't have anyone in the bureaucracy, especially in the judiciary, and in the police. And they picked up some people that they thought they can depend on more. But when we come to the case of Hrant Dink, there were so many people who were involved in that case. Hundreds of people, because they knew and they didn't do anything. And AK Party had to use some of them and brought them in, high places. And now, just lately, only a couple of months, they are getting rid of them. So, although when you talk to on a one-to-one basis with the AK Party people, they will tell you how they want that case to be solved. But when it comes to the, real politics, if I may say so, then it's a different situation. Turkey is going through a very important transformation. It's like a revolution, but it's extended in time. And AK Party keeps up with that revolution by getting 50% in every election. And in order to get that 50%, he goes in zigzags. So that's the situation. And the makeup.
Just quickly, because I use the term, just so you don't misunderstand, I didn't use that as to what my opinion is. I use that as what the Armenian perception is, subjectively. And you mentioned, since you mentioned Hrant Dink, Hrant had a favorite, very famous saying. He said, the Armenians are victims of trauma and Turks are victims of paranoia. So the victims of trauma, part of their symptoms, right? Rightfully so, is to not trust and to be suspicious of almost anything. And unfortunately, for the reasons given that have nothing to do with Armenians. These are internal struggles in Turkey. First, it was the Erdogan government came to power as a government, but they couldn't do much, was the statements made, because the state of Turkey was still in the hands of those that ran it for 80 years, which are the descendants of CUP and CHP, which is its offspring, the current opposition. And now recently, 3-4 years ago, it was sort of clear that the government was also taking over the state. So everybody felt better about progress on all the minority issues from the statements made, because that old state was the resistance. But now we have this split of the coalition that took out the old state, and now there's a fight over, again, the state apparatus, and we're being told, again, you got to be patient. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, this is Sabiha Sanyocar from Turkey, Istanbul, from Turkish Economic and Social Studies Foundation.
So what brought you here?
Well, we have been working on Turkish-Armenian relations for the last almost like 10 years, for 8 years, since 2006. It was first when I went to Armenia, and since then we have been very active at the civil society side to engage dialogue with the Armenians, and now we have very good friends and colleagues in Armenia. And then since the last 2 years also we are trying to engage into this dialogue with the Armenian diaspora, Armenian communities living outside of Armenia, and that's why we are here.
So tell me about your history. You were just telling us about how do you got, at what age or what time you become familiar with that?
Actually, as it was described in the panel, I mean, we had actually, let me put it that way.
We're talking about you personally.
Yes, we had a very one way of reading of history in Turkey. So till I went to Netherlands for my graduate studies, I only had one narrative of reading of what has happened during the establishment of the Republic, during the Anatolian history, establishment of the civilizations and whatever. And in that class, there was a discussion of this, and everyone was referring at the Armenian Genocide, this happened. It wasn't a really Turkey-Armenia class. It has nothing to do with it. But the discussion came like that. I didn't really react, very negatively, but of course I was offended with the discussions there. And at the end of the class, the professor told me that, Sabia, we need to talk with you. And he gave me a list of readings saying that just make these readings and then come to me. We'll talk with you again. I went to the library. I found out those readings. It was the first time that I was reading so opposite narrative that I was used to. And I read all of these. I went to the professor. We had a couple of discussions with him, saying that he said that I'm not saying that this is wrong or this is right, but there are different readings in the history. So I think you're old enough to learn these different readings, and this was my first introduction. Let me say that there's a different narrative, and I was at 22. I was at 22, 23 or something.